a bit of a young Mick Donges lookalike? Yeah, you know it. You know, it's funny because Hollywood portrays famous scenes out of the Bible so much so that we then begin to portray our own meaning based on the story that's popularized, right? And this morning I want to look at this story. It's part of our Holy John-oly series as we're working through the Gospel of John. And I really have two questions that I want to answer this morning. What is Jesus' issue? Because there clearly was one. What is Jesus' issue, and why does he have this issue? So let's jump into the text as we always do, and let's try and get a bit of a grasp of what's actually going on, and then let's hone in on one or two things that John wants to show us in this text. All right, so we read from chapter 2, verse 13. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, immediately we've got to stop here because John is giving us some very important information for the context and the setting of this story, which is that Passover is about to kick off. Now, you may or may not recall what Passover is. It was one of the most significant celebrations or festivals for the Jews that centered around or celebrated the fact that God delivered the Israelite ancestors out of where? Out of Egypt. See, the angel came to knock off the firstborn of the Egyptians, but God had made provision for the Israelites that if they used the blood of a sacrificial lamb and painted it on their doorframe, then the angel would pass over, hence the name of the festival, and eventually they were delivered. And what this means, though, in contextualizing our story is simply this. Jerusalem was packed, right? We're talking chockers. Think Bright on the Easter long weekend, right? People everywhere. No bread left at Woolies, definitely no milk. You see, all the Jews who were living spread out amongst the Roman Empire would make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to participate in Passover because that's where it was held, only at the temple, which was only in Jerusalem. And so Jesus and his disciples have come to Jerusalem to participate in Passover, and it's chockers. And so they arrive at the temple, and this is where the drama begins. Verse 14. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. Now, before we get to the theatrics, you might be wondering, why are there people selling animals in the temple along with currency traders in the first place, right? Like, no wonder Jesus is cross. But we have to get ourselves out of our 21st century worldview to catch what's actually going on here. You see, John is not depicting this scenario, right? Where there were cows inside the temple or a church building like you or me might think. No, John, in the first century, the temple wasn't so much, a building, one, standing, freestanding, modern building like this. It actually looked more like this. It was a whole precinct. There was a number of courtyards and different buildings that together was referred to as the temple. And so Jesus comes into this temple complex, and in one of the outer courtyards, he encounters this like mini zoo, right? A whole bunch of animals for sale, a bunch of currency traders as well. Now, the reason that the animals and the currency traders were there was actually quite simple and very logical. You see, not all Jews lived in Jerusalem, right? In fact, a lot of them lived a very long way away from Jerusalem. And travel, unlike today, was very hard in the ancient world, right? I mean, we pop over the gap to Mount Beauty or vice versa, and it takes what, like half an hour? Don't ask me how long it took me the day I rushed Zeph to the hospital. 13 minutes. It takes like half an hour. But if you were trying to do that journey in the first century, that would be a trip that would take you 2 to 3 days. And I want you to think, this was not a pleasant hike. I know some of you fitness buffs are like, oh, I'd love that. This wasn't a pleasant hike in the sun. Not only did you have to walk 2 to 3 days journey, but you had to haul all of your food. You had to take with you all of your shelter in order to stay the night. You had to take all of your water, all of the children, all of the elderly. Like, there was a lot to take, right? And so the last thing that you wanted, think about this, the last thing that you wanted was to add to the nightmare by having to bring all the animals that you planned to sacrifice, right? Because not only would you have to bring them, you would have to bring all of the food and all of the water in order to keep them alive for the journey. And so some forward-thinking people saw an opportunity in the market to service the hordes of Jews that were traveling to Jerusalem from far-off places by providing animals to purchase at the temple. The place where they had to bring them to sacrifice them anyway, right? It makes a lot of sense. Not only that, but there was a bunch of temple taxes and offerings that, according to Jewish law, could only be paid for in certain currencies. And so again, if you lived somewhere abroad in the Roman Empire, there was an extremely good chance that you actually used or were paid in a currency that was not accepted at the temple. And so you had to find a way to exchange your home currency in order to get the local currency. And this was why the money traders were there, right? To help facilitate the exchange of all the different types of currencies the Jews living abroad might bring in order to use the only ones that were accepted. Makes sense, right? Pretty logical. And yet as Jesus comes into the temple, he sees this mini zoo, he sees these marketplace, and he's not wrapped. And things begin to escalate. Verse 15. So he made a whip out of cords and drove them all from the temple courts. Where am I? As well as sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here." All right. So at this point, if you're like anything like me, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, whoa, like chill out, Jesus, right? Like, what's the big deal here? I mean, these people are only trying to help make it a little more practical for people who live miles away to come and worship, right? To come and participate in the temple. What's the big deal? Well, we find out in verse 16 when Jesus says this. He says, "Stop turning my Father's house into a market." Now, the problem with this translation, "Stop turning my Father's house into a market," is that it misses the grammatical emphasis in the Greek, and so ends up leading us to conclude that Jesus was angry about something that he actually wasn't. You see, what's the emphasis of this statement when it's read in English? Stop turning my Father's house into a market. What's the emphasis? That they're turning the Father's house into a market. That's the emphasis. Market, for all those grammar noobs, is the direct object which is being modified by the verb turning. Market is the emphasis. And so reading this in English, we appropriately conclude that Jesus' issue is the market or the activity of the market. And if we do a little digging or engage in a little critical thinking, we begin to find or highlight things that seem to justify this. Because there was this mandated need to have specific blemish-free sacrifices or specific currencies to trade at the temple, the traders in the temple had a bit of a monopoly, right? Like, think about the last time you went to the airport and realized you didn't have a power bank that matched the country you were going to. Who knows you paid a premium for that sucker, right? And this was what was happening here. There was definitely a sense that the money changers or the animal traders were almost certainly exploiting the people that were purchasing from them. And so this seems to reinforce our reading in English that Jesus' issue was with the market, was with those dodgy capitalists making money. However, this isn't Jesus' issue. Nor is it the primary emphasis of the text when we read it in its original language, the Greek. You see, the phrase, "stop turning my father's house into a market," in the Greek is this: "Mi poiete ton oikon tu patros moi oikon emporio." Now, I want to ask you a question, because without even knowing Greek, can you notice, or did you notice as I spoke that there's an emphasis that this phrase is emphasizing? There's one word that's repeated twice here. Did you pick it up? Mi poiete ton oikon tu patros moi oikon emporio. We don't see that in the Greek, in the English, right? We don't see a repeated word, and yet there is one here in the Greek. And when we translate this verbatim, you know what this phrase reads? It reads, "Stop turning my father's house into a house of trade." You see, this is a play on words. But it's more than that, because it actually shifts the emphasis of the meaning as well. You see, what's the grammatical emphasis? What's the word being emphasized in "stop turning my father's house into a house of trade"? House. House is the emphasis. And so rather than Jesus primarily being upset with the market or with the activity of the market, he's upset, listen to this, with the location of the market. The house of the Father has now become a house of business. Jesus' issue is not that he's opposed to people having the ability to buy animals closer to Jerusalem or have a service to exchange money. His issue is that it was happening in the house of God. Now, if you're anything like me, you still can't help but ask the question, why? Like, what's the big deal with having the animals and money changers on site when that's literally where they're going to have to come to sacrifice and give their offerings anyway? Like, seems pretty efficient to me, right? If Adam was in the first century, he would have loved the efficiency of this. I would have too. But we get our answer in verse 17. And this verse, I believe, is really the linchpin to this whole story. It's really important, because not only does it help us understand why Jesus isn't rapt about the businesses operating inside God's house, but it actually speaks prophetically of the implications moving forward. Let's read. "So he made a whip out of cords and drove them all from the temple courts, as well as the sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, 'Get these out of here. Stop turning my father's house into a house of trade.'" And now we find out why. His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." All right. What's happening here? Well, in order to make sure that we don't miss the why, that we're not confused by Jesus' emphasis on the house and the location versus the market itself, John actually fleshes out Jesus' why. He fleshes out why Jesus isn't happy by including some very helpful narration about Jesus' disciples remembering a passage from Psalm 69. And the passage or the excerpt is, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And this, "zeal for your house will consume me," becomes the interpretive light that John wants us to understand Jesus' actions through. That it's his zeal for God's house that's causing him to act this way. Now, there's two things I want to point out super quickly. Firstly, the word zeal, or zelos in Greek, means jealousy or jealous passion. It doesn't mean anger. Too often people or Hollywood want to paint a picture that, Jesus is angry, that he's on a rage, that he's rah, some of those. It's not what's going on here. Yes, he's emotional, but that emotion isn't anger, it's zeal. It's jealous passion for God's house. The second thing I want to clarify is this. What does it mean to be zealous for God's house? What does it mean to be zealous for the temple? Like we said, Jesus' issue is not with the business activities in and of themselves, but the location of where they're occurring. So what is it about his zeal or passion for the church or passion for the temple that's motivating or causing him to have issue with these activities going on in the outer courts? Well, the answer to this question is found when we recall the purpose, everyone say purpose of the temple. Because it's quite a bit more deeper than Jesus just wanting a little bit more decorum or a little bit more reverence on a Sunday morning, right? It's a bit deeper than that. Praise the Lord, this is not, hear me, this is not a first century equivalent of a pastor wearing ripped jeans in church. This is not what's going on here. This is not about reverence. There's something far more emphatic at stake. Does anyone recall what the purpose of the temple was? I'll give you a little hint. In Exodus, before the temple became a permanent structure in Jerusalem, what was the temple called in the days of Moses? Tabernacle. Well done. God instructed the children of Israel to pitch the tabernacle. And it had another meaning that was used or another word that was used interchangeably with the tabernacle. And I gave you a bit of a hint when I said that they pitched it. Do you remember what the other meaning or the other word for tabernacle was? The tent of meeting. Now don't get confused. 3 names: temple, tabernacle, tent of meeting, same thing, right? 3 names, same thing. It was the place where Israel met God, right? In fact, the word tabernacle or temple literally means dwelling place. And so the temple, until Jesus' death and resurrection, was the primary place that God had committed to dwell. It was the primary place that he had committed to manifest his presence, right? Like the temple was where and how you encountered or connected with God. And this is important. Because when it says, "Zeal for your house will consume me," it's not talking about a physical structure or an institution called the church. It's talking about connection with God or intimacy with God. It was Jesus' passion for intimacy or connection with God that consumed him. I'll say that again. It was Jesus' passion or zeal for connection with God or intimacy with God that consumed him. It wasn't reverence. It was his jealous passion to connect or to be intimate with God that motivated him to drive out these traitors. And why? And I want you to catch this. Because even in the right context, listen to this, even in the right context, emphasizing the wrong thing will lead to the wrong outcome. I'll say that again. Even in the right context, emphasizing the wrong thing will lead to the wrong outcome. You see, while the service or the business practice in and of itself maybe wasn't wrong, the moment it appeared inside the temple changed the emphasis of the temple. No longer was the temple a place to connect with God, but a place to transact with God. Big difference. Think of this analogy. The presence of physical intimacy in a marriage is a good thing, right? Anyone going to say amen to that? Like God designed procreation, and because he's God, he also made the process pretty enjoyable. But listen to this. If a spouse was to emphasize this above and beyond the purpose of marriage itself, if this physical intimacy became the sole craving, the single emphasis of that marriage, who knows that that simple shift in emphasis would literally corrupt the whole thing. You see, emphasizing the wrong thing, even in the right context, leads to the wrong outcome. And essentially, this is what was happening. In promoting the trade, in emphasizing transaction over connection, the religious leaders of the day successfully corrupted the whole purpose of the temple. And ultimately, this is why Jesus is literally cracking the whip. This is why he's turning over tables. Because hear this, God desires more than anything that we connect with him, not transact with him. God desires that we connect with him, not transact with him. And this is the challenge for us this morning, right? This is the question we must ask ourselves. Are we connecting with God, or are we just transacting with him? Are there things in our life that maybe in and of themselves aren't bad, that have shifted the emphasis of our life and in so doing corrupted it? I mean, chasing a more financially free or secure life in and of itself is not a bad thing. I mean, we talked last week about Jesus and his kingdom being characterized by abundance, right? And it is. But let me tell you this, if it becomes our emphasis, if abundance becomes our emphasis, if financial freedom becomes our emphasis, it will corrupt our intimacy with Jesus. It will corrupt the capacity for God to use us. It will corrupt God's ability to speak to us and for us to hear him. It will corrupt his ability to bring about the real and lasting life that he promises us. You know, staying up to date with the news or the world of social media or whatever epic TV series is out on Netflix, Disney, or Amazon isn't a bad thing in and of itself. But if this is the emphasis of our free time or our attention, then whether we like it or not, we will hurriedly, at the start of the day or just before we go to bed, quickly read a Bible verse or two, quickly throw out a prayer for our kids or our neighbor or whatever crisis we want God to fix for us. And in so doing, continue transacting with God instead of connecting with Him. You see, connection can't be bluffed. It doesn't matter what we profess or how passionately or genuinely we profess it. If our words aren't embodied by actions, then we're transacting, not connecting. And the truth of the matter is this. I need you to hear this morning. God has zero, everyone say zero. God has zero interest in transacting with you. He wants to connect with you. In fact, zeal for that connection consumed him. And this is the sobering reality of Jesus' statement. You see, not only does John want us to interpret Jesus' actions through this statement, but he wants us to understand the invitation of this statement. You see, having caused this ruckus, the temple authorities are insulted by Jesus' actions because effectively he's accusing them of misappropriating God's temple, right? Of commodifying God rather than edifying connection with him. And so they bite back. Verse 18. The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do this?" As in, if you're going to claim that we've corrupted God's temple, us, the high priests, the devout religious leaders, then that we're emphasizing the wrong thing, then man, you better have something to back this up, Jesus. Jesus answers them. "Destroy the temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple that he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that was spoken. You know what's remarkable about this story? It's not just that Jesus' zeal for God's house, Jesus' zeal to connect with God consumed him in the sense that it drove him or became the focal point or emphasis of his life, but that it consumed him. Like literally consumed him, as in led him to the cross, kind of consumed him. And this is the invitation of this statement for us. You see, John isn't just imploring us to just emphasize connection with God above and beyond transacting with him. He's inviting us to be consumed by that connection. And I'll tell you why. Because this is the only way that salvation comes, both to and through us. You see, you can be consumed by God, consumed by the desire to connect and elevate intimacy with him in your life. But if you're not consumed by God, if that connection and if that intimacy doesn't consume you or consume your rights in your marriage or consume the way you spend your money or consume the things you allow your eyes to see or the things you allow your feet to take you, the persisting anger issues that just kind of sit there in your heart, the persistent fear issues, the persistent lukewarm faith issues, if we let them coexist in our heart and our life, rather than be consumed by God and connection with him, then that's where we run into trouble. And I get it, right? Because it's so much easier transacting with God than it is to connect with him, right? But if that's the case, then we will never find ourselves, as Jesus was, consumed by love and intimacy with God. Instead, we'll find ourselves guilty of the Apostle James's great warning in the first chapter of his letter. But be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving. I like this translation. Don't just listen to the word of truth and not respond to it, for that is the essence of self-deception. Friends, zeal for God's house, zeal for connection and intimacy with God consumed Jesus. It was the one thing that mediated or regulated how he lived his life. God desires that we connect with him and not just transact with him. But it goes one step further. Zeal for intimacy with God didn't just consume Jesus. It didn't just dominate his mind or monopolize his heart. His intimacy with God consumed him. It embodied his actions. It engulfed his life. And this is the invitation for us this morning. Will you connect instead of just transacting with God? And will your life be consumed by that connection in such a way that it brings salvation to the world around you? Let's pray.